Welcome, advocates, to another episode of the Inequity podcast, a podcast that focuses on supporting educators with the tools and resources necessary to ensure equity at their schools. Today's special guest is Dr. ClauDean Kizart. So without further ado, Dr. K, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I really enjoy your book. I really have enjoyed your podcast. So I'm very grateful to be a guest today. Thank you.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. I'm excited to learn about your book. Congratulations on recently publishing with Solution Tree. Before we get into it, I'd love for you to start with sharing a little bit about yourself and what you currently do.
I am a woman from the South Side of Chicago. Have two children and been an educator for 26 years now. I started out in the field of education in special education when special education was in the basement, and was part of that movement to ensure that there was inclusion for students who needed special services and students with disabilities. So I currently live in Virginia, and I work at a community college as the director of student success, and also have a consulting company, Dunning Kruger Inc., where I focus on supporting businesses and institutions, higher ed, schools, in the work of cultivating more equitable and inclusive school communities for all.
All right. Well, welcome. And you're an author. Let's talk about the name of the book. I believe it's Beyond Implicit and Explicit Bias: Strategies for Healing the Root Causes of Inequity in Education. Folks, there's a link in the show notes, so make sure you grab yourself a copy and support Dr. K and her work. I do a lot of implicit bias work as well. And so as I was looking through your book and I looked at the chapters, there's a lot of different types of biases that you have mentioned. And so I kind of wanted to run some of those down today for our discussion. And the first one that I see here is the Dunning Kruger effect bias. So I want to start there. Tell us a little bit about what that is and maybe some examples that we might see in our classrooms.
If you don't mind, I want to backtrack just a little bit about why the title is what it is. For years, I went to trainings on biases, and often I saw that we would talk a lot about implicit and explicit bias. And the reason that it's beyond implicit and explicit bias is because there are certain biases that have been researched similar to the Dunning Kruger effect since the 70s, some the early 50s, like in-group bias and herd mentality. Those biases have been researched for many, 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 many years. I find it very interesting that it hasn't been until recently that we are starting to have conversations about specific biases. And I thought that in order to really navigate through and manage our biases, we need to know exactly what they are. It's not, for me, it's not enough to just say, I'm navigating through implicit bias. Well, what implicit bias? Or explicit bias? Well, what explicit bias? The Oxford Dictionary website, they have over 200 listed biases. So that's why it's beyond implicit and explicit bias. The other thing is I used to work with a woman when I lived in Missouri. And one day she said, Dr. K, I don't have bias. And I was like, sure, we all do. Okay, because biases are similar to preferences. And that's one of the things that Harvard implicit bias test it shows us is what our preferences are. And it's nothing wrong with having a preference, except for when that preference then harms others, particularly students and people in which we serve. Dr. Beverly Tatum said bias is like smog. It's in the air. We all and we just have to learn how to manage them. So the other reason that the subtitle is strategies is because I didn't want to live just in biases. I wanted to support readers, and including myself, in how to navigate and manage those biases.
Okay. Well, thank you for providing the context for us. So let's run down the Dunning Kruger effect.
Okay, so Dunning Kruger effect happens. First of all, that is a bias that has been researched since 1999, starting with two psychologists. One was Dunning and one was Kruger. What they did was they observed leaders and concluded that often leaders who have a specialty in something often feel as though they have a specialty in everything. So Dunning-Kruger effect happens when we are an expert in something. And because we are an expert in something, sometimes we can then assume that we then know everything about that topic. For example, I'll go back to something you and I talked about before we started the show. And you can tell that you've done a lot, you do a lot of equity work, because part of equity work is navigating through your own biases. And so one of the things, and I hope you don't mind me sharing, and edit it out if not, but one of the things that we talked about was your knowledge and experience with biases and with work on bias. But you said, I don't know very much about the Dunning-Kruger effect and in-group bias. I'd like to talk specifically about those. So you can tell you've navigated through some of your biases, because you could have easily said, well, I've done a lot about work about biases. Can we just talk about the strategies or something like that, right? And so the Dunning-Kruger effect happens when we overestimate how knowledgeable and skilled we are in something and in a particular area.
Thank you for sharing. I mean, like you said, there's like over 200 different types of biases. So even someone that does implicit bias work a lot, there's a few that I just haven't come across or just haven't really dug into. And so I appreciate you for laying out the definition from the Dunning-Kruger effect. Let's transition that to classroom or maybe leadership. What are some examples that we might see with the Dunning-Kruger effect on our educational spaces?
In my book, I talk about very real scenarios, things that have actually occurred. Of course, I change names, titles, and schools and things of that nature. But anytime you hear someone say, I already know that, that is like a telltale kind of sign that you might be navigating with a bias regarding Dunning-Kruger effect, because there's so much to learn. One of my god sisters once told me, a lot of people call me Chinaka in my community, and she said, Chinaka, when you realize that you know this much, then you also realize that there's this much more to learn. And when you realize that you've learned this much, then you realize there's a larger circle of information that you still don't know. And so that's why learning is both cyclical and continuous at the same time. So the way that a Dunning-Kruger bias would show up, for example, and I use one of the examples in my book, and a superintendent at a particular school is having some challenges with achievement gaps, which I also use synonymous with equity gaps, because where there are equity gaps, there's also achievement gaps. We're looking at what's happening that is causing those issues with achievement and who's achieving and who's not achieving. This was a particular school district that was dealing with and navigating with an influx, particularly of Hispanic students. And this was at an equity lab that myself and a colleague and I led, because our job was to support them in looking through their data and finding what those equity and or achievement gaps were. And what we saw, and what we had a conversation with this particular superintendent and their administration about, it was the Hispanic students, particularly, that were doing poorly in particularly math and reading. The superintendent said, well, already hired a diversity person, and I have family who are Hispanic, so we think we've got a real hold on that. So came back the next year. Our job was again to look at what's the growth and things of that nature. Not only were those achievement and equity gaps worse, they were now, you could see that a lot of those Hispanic students were also having discipline issues in the classroom and being suspended at higher rates. And this particular superintendent was still like, I already know what we need to do. I've been a superintendent for a very long time. Like I said, I have family who's Hispanic. We already know what to do.
So why are you there? Like, my question is, like, if you know everything, what do you need me for?
Well, part of it was my job was to go to schools that were experiencing academic challenges. And because I worked for the state at that time, it was some of it was voluntary and some of it was voluntold.
I got you. Okay, why are you even there?
You're gonna get Dr. K and this other person to come and support your school because you're having some challenges that you address. Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like he didn't really want you there. It's like you're required to be there, and so he's already defensive. So he sounded like he was defensive.
Oh, absolutely.
It's what I'm hearing. So so if I have a certain level of defense, as you're kind of explaining the definition, and I was thinking, like, how many veteran teachers or veteran whatever leaders that kind of like what you said, like, oh, I already know this, or, oh, this is my daily experience. I know I talk to a lot of people of color, for example, that will say, well, I already know everything that has to do with diversity because I live this every day. And so they're not necessarily open to some of these conversations. Yeah. And so that's what I'm hearing as you're explaining this situation here.
Yeah. Dr. Jamal Watson, he's the senior editor at Diverse Magazine, one of my favorite brothers. He and I were recently talking about how much we know and don't know. And it's really inappropriate to assume that just because you are African American or just because you are Hispanic or Asian or any ethnicity that has historically been marginalized that we know about diversity, because that's just simply not true. Simply not true. There is so much to learn and so much we need to learn about other cultures, about religious diversity and social economic diversity, right? Just even the thought of, and that's another area of Dunning Kruger effect. There was a person on the news probably about 4 months ago who was a chief diversity officer at a particular university. And she was resigning because they were asked to talk about pronouns. And she was like, it's against my religion to do that. Well, when you talk about diversity, it can't be, and even equity, it can't just be equity for you or diversity for you. That's part of where we've missed the mark with the work of equity and inclusion is we've sometimes been exclusive in that work, and that exclusivity has caused a challenge that it's important that we own so that we can heal.
Yeah, selective equity work is what I like to refer to it as.
I love that.
Yeah. Like as long as it aligns with my beliefs, my morals, my values, then I'm on board. But as soon as it's against something that I'm like, I know a lot of folks that will be all about racial equity, but then you talk about LGBTQ plus communities, things like that. Oh, well, I don't agree with their, you know what I'm saying? And so, like, I'll be on board for certain causes. I'll be on board for certain missions, and I'll post and the awareness, and I'll change my status on social media for certain things.
Absolutely. I have a 14-year-old son. He's brilliant. And last Saturday we were outside raking leaves, and he said, well, Mom, don't you think that the people who are doing like DEI work that also discriminate against other people, don't you think they're causing harm too? Because if you know how it feels to be discriminated against out of the mouths of babes, if you know how it feels to be discriminated against, then it would seem like you wouldn't do it. Yeah. And I was like, you need to come along with me, sir. Because the 14-year-old got it. This can't be exclusive. It needs to be inclusive.
So I'm glad you started with that, because it's got me thinking, like, how do we help? So first of all, let me back up. I don't think that we can get rid of bias. Like, it's human nature. Like, it's who we are. It's human nature. And I tell any audience I'm in front of, I say, look, I have bias. I do this all the time, and I have all kind of biases. But I'm worried about the Dunning Kruger effect, because it's almost as if you feel like you don't have a bias. Like it kind of comes across that way. It's like, oh, I already know this, or yeah, we're well aware of this. We don't need your help. We got it figured out. How do you help, or how do you, like, what do you say to an individual in these type of situations to get them the support, the help that they need?
But one of the things that I love about it is, it has observation and assessment too, and so opportunities to reflect. Anytime I facilitate professional development, I always start with breath work. Sometimes when we're operating out of that, I know there's a fear that maybe someone will see that I don't know this, or I don't know enough, or maybe I don't feel like I'm enough. Because listen, no matter what type of power you have in this world, that feeling of not enoughness, it can track and go with you wherever you go. One of the most important things is being self-reflective, because when we're self-reflective, then we can be open. Another thing is having social circles and friends and family who will say, hey, that was out of pocket. I am grateful to have people in my life who will check me, who will say, ClauDean, I know that you said da da da, but I want you to check your hypocrisy on this. And I want you to check the fact that you're not being very open. Some of it is self-reflection. The other thing is who we surround ourselves with, and whether those people are brave enough, and if we've established relationship enough to say, hold on, take a beat, take a breath.
Yeah.
And just be open.
Just be open. So it starts with self. So we can't do this work unless we're willing to acknowledge, hey, look, I need some help. It's just like any kind of self-help book, whatever it is, strategies. This is part of it. And I love that you have journaling, self-reflection opportunities so that we can be aware of it. I'm going to shift gears for just a moment, because I know like a lot of people reach out to me and say, I need talking points. How do I call someone out when it comes to this? So let's say I'm in a situation, I'm at school, and I am talking to a veteran teacher or a fellow colleague or whatever it is, and they start saying, oh, no, I know this. I got this already. I got it handled. How do I respond? Do I tell them, see, this is the Dunning Kruger effect. This is what you're doing right now. Like, give us some talking points as far as maybe some ways that we can address this when our colleagues are displaying the attributes or characteristics of a Dunning-Kruger effect bias.
So and I'm going to use some of the questions from the bias assessment tool in my book. And so one of the questions that's a self-reflection question is I ask for constructive feedback. And so we could then turn that into a question with and for the person that you're navigating with. You say, hey, are you open to some constructive feedback? Pause. Because sometimes we have to think, am I open to constructive feedback? And listen, some people will tell you, no, I'm not. No, I'm not, right? And unfortunately, those are people that sometimes we have to just leave alone.
Thank you for saying that.
They're not there yet. They're not there yet. We're not trying to pull people out of cement. Some people are standing 10 toes down in their own self-righteous indentation. Some people are like, nope, this is where I live. I want to stay right here. One of the things that got me really interested in bias was an interaction with my children's friend. When we were living in Alton, Illinois, and Alton, Illinois is a very racially diverse place. And so my children have friends from all kind of walks of life, of many ethnic groups. At the time, I had a bird, an African gray bird. His name's Claude. He passed a couple of months ago. And I observed that when one of the friends went over to the cage and was like, hi, Claude, and put her hand by Claude, I was like, you need to move your hand. Like, I remember that, like, I had a visceral, nervous in my body, like, move your hand. And the way that I responded was really snappy. Interesting, a couple of seconds later, one of the other kids came over, same age, and put her hand over there. And I said, you better move your hand. I did not have the same visceral effect or the same response. That's the week before, I had just taken the Harvard implicit bias test. And what it showed was that I have a preference for African American children, for Black children, Black people. And I said, I understand that as a Black woman, I can see that I have a preference. But it wasn't until that moment, right after I took that test, because now I have the knowledge, that I observed that the way that I spoke to those two children was completely different. One of them was a white girl, the other one was a Black girl. And almost immediately I said, oh my goodness, where did that come from? And it dawned on me that I was quick, like, with the white girl, because I was like, I don't want your mother to get mad and sue me. My brain, that's how fast my brain went. I don't want her to get mad and sue me. But with the Black girl, I was like, in my mind, if I tell your mother you put your hand over there, I tell you not to, she gonna be like, hey, she told you not to put your hand over there. So I immediately was like, hey, you all. So I just pulled all the children together, because I was like, you know what, that wasn't fair. It wasn't fair to me. It wasn't fair to that young girl that I spoke to her in that way. It was very stern. And I said, hey, I brought them all together because now I'm going to be equitable in my communication. Hey, this is a bird. Anything that has a beak, anything that has teeth can bite. So please don't anybody put their hand on the bird cage. Okay? It just made it light and breezy. And everybody said, okay. And it's possible to check our own selves, ask ourselves, when you notice that you're behaving in a particular way, what's going on with me? And then if you know that your friend or your coworker is acting in a particular way, particularly as it relates to Dunning Kruger, you can ask them another question, like, are you comfortable seeking assistance of other people? Like, this person is here to help us, or this information, this data is going to help us. Are you open to this information in a way that's going to help our students?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your story and for being vulnerable in this space. And you know what really stood out to me, because I think you and I are aligned. At the end of the day, there's just some people that you just like, it don't matter what you say. It is what it is. Like you said, they're going to stand 10 toes. However, I don't know if it's the nature of education. As teachers, we want to help people, and it's just who we are. I tried this way, I tried that way. And how do I get this person? How do I convince this individual that there are biases? Or how do I convince them that equity is important? And no matter what I do, there's just some people that are stuck in their mindset. And a lot of it, again, we're talking about bias, has to do with maybe where they grew up in the social circles, the news stations that they watch. They're convinced, and there's nothing you can do to change their mind with one or two interactions. It's gonna, if they do change, it might take multiple touches. It might have their neighbor might come to them and say the exact same thing that you've been saying for the last 20 years. And then all of a sudden, or a tragedy, news, something happens and it changes their mind or perspective. Or again, there's just some people that just, this is who they are, is not going to change. So I'm so glad that you've mentioned that, because I get that all the time. And it was hard for me too, because like when I would do trainings, I'm here for an hour, for a workshop, for a half day, whatever. Like it's 60 minutes. Like I'm not good. But when I first started, I legit thought I was going to change everybody's mind, everybody's life in an hour or within 45-minute speech, whatever it was. Like, but then I had to accept, you know what? Sometimes it just takes a little bit more in order for folks to kind of get on board, or at least to see different perspectives.
And sometimes I find that sharing our own story helps. As human beings, we don't like to be outsiders. We want to know that we belong. That's just like a human, as a physiological need, is to know that we're seen, valued, and heard. When I come in and I share my story first, or at least I share something about myself as it relates to a bias and how I manage and navigate, then it also kind of softens the space for other people to do so as well. Similar to relationships, when people are vulnerable and you cultivate that relationship of vulnerability, it does make an impact.
Well, it humanizes you as well, like, because again, you're viewed as the expert or whatever topic subject you're going to be discussing for that space. And just to be able to say, look folks, look, I messed up too. Like I like to share story. Like, This is what I did last week. I was very biased. I have 2 kids. My kids call me out all the time. Daddy, that is a halo bias that you're doing. That is confirmation bias, Daddy. Like, they will call me out all the time. So it's just how it is. But being able to kind of create that space was, look, I'm here. I'm giving you training. I'm giving you support, but I also have my biases. Here are some tools and resources that I'm going to provide to you to support you in those goals. But at the end of the day, we're going to leave this space today and we will both still have biases. So if we can agree to that, then we can move forward. But again, it does require us to have these kind of conversations, to be able to express ourselves, to share, say, hey, there are biases out there and how can we be more aware so we can try to mitigate as much as we can.
Yeah, and I will slide this in. That's another thing that I like about this book is that at the end of each chapter, there are strategies, like specific tips for counteracting each bias. So one of the tips for counteracting the Dunning Kruger effect is listen to students and colleagues regardless of their status. Remember that we can learn from each other.
Got you. I got you. One of the biggest pieces or takeaways from today's conversation was the fact that asking someone, hey, is it okay if I give you some constructive criticism? Are you open to some feedback? And allowing that individual the opportunity to say yay or nay. And if they say no, it's not the end of the world. I worry because those kids, those people might be in front of children, but at the end of the day, maybe this is not the time. Maybe they need to sit on it. Maybe this is an opportunity for you to do your own self-reflection again and see if there's something else that you can do at the end of the day. But this is really good feedback. I'll say this, Dr. K, I have thoroughly learned a lot and I've enjoyed. It's funny because you and I, before we even hit record, we're like, okay, we're going to go down all these different type of biases. And folks, there's several biases that are mentioned throughout this book. I mean, each chapter, chapter 3 talks about herd mentality. Chapter 4 is anchoring bias. Chapter 5 is decision fatigue bias. 6 is intergroup. And then chapter 7 is scarcity bias. So we just touched the surface when it comes to different biases out there with just discussing Dunning Kruger effect. But Dr. K, I'd love for you to share any final words of advice that you want to provide to our listeners.
There's a quote that says, now is the seed from which later will grow. It's really important that we be mindful of the seeds that we're planting right now. We are in a country that has, the beauty of this country is the diversity. Diversity is not a bad word. Beauty is the diversity. It's really important that we learn to manage how we relate to one another, particularly when we have have the lives of students in our hand. Our students are listening to us, they're learning from us, and they need to learn as well that differences are okay and that we live in a space where we can honor each other's differences in a way that we're all seen, valued, and heard. Part of that work is learning how to move beyond our implicit and explicit biases and developing those strategies to do so.
See, I love how it's moving beyond as opposed to getting rid of or eradicating. Again, we will continue to have biases, but these are some things that we can go beyond implicit and explicit bias. Folks, there's a link in the show notes for the book itself, so make sure you support. But Dr. K, if we have some folks that want to connect with you, what's the best way to reach you online?
DrKizart @gmail.com. Of course, like majority of educators, I am on LinkedIn as Dr. ClauDean Kizart, Kizart.
All right. Well, Dr. K, it has truly been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.